This lecture is Beyond the Feminine Mystique, looking at women from 1945 to 1965. A little historical context in the post-World War II era. This is a very paradoxical time where we see a lot of anxiety due to the Cold War, but a lot of economic affluence and sort of worldwide prestige that also comes from the US's participation in World War II. After World War II, we see the US quickly enter a Cold War with the Soviet Union and other communist countries, in which the US foreign policy of containment was used sort of as this sort of umbrella tactic to try to aim at containing, defeating communism for the next 30 plus years. So containment was all about looking at the threat of communism and what it posed to US freedom, democracy, and this poster sort of sums that up, right? Is this tomorrow, America under communism? Where you see the American flag being burned and these communists sort of taking over and strangling individual rights and liberties. So there's sort of this resurgence of the Red Scare mentality, and we see that in a number of acts that were, forcing unions to expel communist members. The House of Un-American Activities Commission was, trying to investigate potential communists or extremists in government and in Hollywood and other sort of public figure roles. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of little tolerance to any kind of extreme ideals. So the other side of this is the, post-World War II prosperity that we see come about. That similarly to World War I in the 1920s, there's an economic boom. And that same boom happens in the 1950s. And a lot of that led to people partaking in a much more consumeristic lifestyle, especially compared to what we see in the 30s. We see the GI Bill that President Roosevelt signed gave, low mortgage and low rate housing opportunities for returning veterans, access to education, and just general, we see just a general suburban growth in the post-World War II era. Highways are connecting the suburbs to the cities and just making it more accessible. John Levitt, this is Levittown in the image here in New York, and you just sort of see he was a housing contractor that found a way to put up tract homes in less than 15 minutes for a really, very low, with very low costs. So all the houses are identical, but this also meant more people could own a home for the first time. And we really see in the 1950s this middle class growth that is unprecedented. So this poster is a poster from World War II. The CIO put it out, right? And it says, "This is America, where the family is a sacred institution, where children love, honor, and respect their parents, where a man's home is his castle. This is your America. Keep it free." So some of the subliminal messages that were being sent to women during World War II while they were working was that this is temporary. And when the war is over, we will celebrate you returning back to the home and return to this patriarchal society where the man is the sole breadwinner or the primary breadwinner. And that's exactly what happens. After World War II ends, women are celebrated for returning back to the home. And we have what a lot of historians have called the revivalism of the cult of domesticity. This true ideology of womanhood didn't go away in the 1920s or the 1930s, but it's revived in a new way in the 1950s, especially in pop culture and women's magazines and TV. So the ideology was that there was security in the home in an insecure world, in the context of the Cold War, and that it was a woman's job to make a safe haven for the family, helping to nurture her kids and socialize the kids to not be delinquents, not turn into communists, or heterosexual, right? There was these clear gender roles that men were to be involved in politics, to be the breadwinners, and this idea that women are supposed to be taking care of the home. And women's civic duty was to steer clear of foreign communist influence and make a positive image to foreign nations to show the world how good capitalism and democracy was. This was going to be a way of defeating the communist countries and win the Cold War. So this is sort of where we see some challenges. How predominant was this kind of revivalism of the cult of domesticity? How pervasive was it? And we can see some arguments for and against it. Some arguments that help that this ideology was pervasive was that we see particularly an increase in births after World War II. For the first time since the turn of the century, women are having more children, and the average family size goes from having 2 children to having 3 in a matter of 15 years. So it's a pretty big increase, which shows us that people are sort of responding to these traditional gender roles that are being sort of portrayed and reinforced in the 1950s. So women are tending to marry younger, just as they had during the World War II era, and have more children. And we'll also see this is going to increase in divorce rates by the 1960s. But there's also just a greater amount of middle class, and the image that was being sold to women is that you're going to move to the suburbs, you're going to have children, you're going to become a mom, you're going to host parties, and your husband will go off to work, and you'll live happily ever after. And I think this happily ever after is really popularized in pop culture. TV sitcoms, sort of portrayed these happy-go-lucky, sort of bland storylines of middle class white America. In 1956, Life magazine said that the woman of the hour was a woman who married her high school sweetheart in her teens. She was pretty and popular. She entertained, liked to sew, did club work and charity work on the side, grocery shopped, helped her children with homework, and had a hot meal ready for her husband every night he got home from work. Right, so this is what Life magazine is considering to be the ideal woman in the 1950s. Right, so overall, family and homemaking is sort of portrayed as the key to happiness and fulfillment. Even advertisers were sort of, chiming in on this revivalism of the cult of domesticity, showing women enjoying their roles as homemakers and having fun with their domestic duties. The reality probably looked a little bit more like this image here, where there's a woman with 3 children trying to get dinner on the table while her kids are in what we call in our house hold the witching hour. Everybody's hungry, everybody's tired, everybody's done. So rethinking the feminine mystique. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which was sort of the modern terminology for the cult of domesticity, right? Where the feminine mystique was that women would find their fulfillment in the home, their children, and their marriage. And Betty Friedan is challenging this popular narrative that a lot of women are not happy that way, and they're discontent. And so she's sort of poking holes into this fairy tale myth that women's main roles should be in the home. And I think there's a lot of evidence to prove that women did not fully embrace this this mythology, this fairy tale. One of that would be that we see 40% of women in the workforce by 1960, and a lot of these were married women. There was more married women from the middle class working as part-time clerical work, sales work in department stores, in professional capacities. And we see that employers are more open to employing women so that they can help support their middle class lifestyles and this kind of consumer lifestyle that's very prevalent in the 1950s. And a lot of the oral histories from this time period tell us that women confess to working is a way of getting outside the home, maybe to get away from their children, to have some adult interactions and contribute to society. So this is one way that we really see kind of this myth of the feminine mystique being not as pervasive as maybe once thought. In the 1950s, 24% of the population were living below poverty lines. So despite this great economic prosperity in the world after World War II, a lot of people worked out of necessity as well. So there's a lot of people that were living outside the quote-unquote suburban dream. Ethnic, racial women, racial minorities were barred from moving to the suburbs until the 1960s because of restrictive covenants that would not allow homes to be sold to non-white Americans. We see in African American magazines, women's magazines like Ebony, there's sort of less of the domestic ideology being discussed compared to the white women's magazines. And we also see that, by the 1960s, a lot of women that were polled said that they wished their daughters would not follow in their footsteps, that they would marry later and get an education. So there's sort of a lot of dissatisfaction that we see. Even for women who were non-heterosexual, lesbian women, there was sort of this security being compromised because of their sexuality, because of the Cold War Red Scare mentality where heterosexuality was defined as normative. Anything outside of that was considered kind of extreme, could be linked with communism, and could be subject to getting you blacklisted. So we do see one exception. In 1955, the San Francisco Gay Civil Rights Organization comes into existence, and it really is going to help the greater society come to a better public understanding of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and others outside of the traditional heterosexual view that society had. We also think of other ways women are sort of operating beyond the feminine mystique, women's activism. Women continue to be politically active throughout the post-World War II era. Their work in the NAACP, the ACLU, the LWV, the League of Women Voters, who are pressing for local issues, and not just in the Cold War sense, but things that are going to be bettering their communities, continue to be a really strong area of focus in the women's community. The YWCA, for instance, really takes a progressive approach in dealing with integration and desegregation in the post-World War II era. Business and professional women are really advocating for equal pay for equal work, and that, quote, the manpower of women to fight the Russians, end quote, was what the U.S. needed to capitalize on, that they should be used to help fight the Cold War. We see the image here, the Women's Strike for Peace in 1961, using their platform as mothers, as kind of the maternal figures in society, to protest against the testing of nuclear bombs and war, which is in some ways very progressive. And for unions, women's rights are being fought for from the union's perspective, for better pay and better working conditions.